When the old grain barn caught fire in Middlebrook County in 1928, the townspeople rushed toward the smoke. They thought a building was burning, but standing in the center of the flames was a man. It was Hector Holloway, the eldest of a family of 9. His face was smeared with ash. Around him, inside a circle of salt, stood 8 lanterns. To the firemen, he said only one thing: "We tried to stop the voice." No one understood what he meant, and no one, except the neighbors, knew that the Holloway family never slept at night, not once. Their curtains never opened. Their windows glowed from dusk until dawn. The Holloway children never attended school. The parents never worked. Their entire life was reversed. They slept during the day, but not inside the house. They slept in a windowless shed, with bundles of wormwood beneath their pillows. After 9 p.m., the house would come alive. They whispered, rewrote pages from ancient books. Sometimes they sang. And once, during a thunderstorm, one of them fell asleep at night. After that, the family boarded up the basement. This is a story about what hides in the dark. A story of a family that lived in reverse. The story of the Holloways. In the summer of 1926, the Holloway family arrived in Middlebrook County, a quiet rural stretch of southeastern Pennsylvania, known more for its wheat harvests than its residents. Their arrival was silent, unannounced, and happened under cover of night. The locals didn't see the moving truck until the next morning. Already half unloaded, the Holloways had chosen to purchase a weathered farmhouse on the northern edge of the valley, a creaking, wire-wrapped structure built in 1861, sitting alone beside a thin stretch of forest and an overgrown field that had not been farmed in decades. Middlebrook had seen newcomers before, strangers who came and went, usually drawn by the affordable land and the promise of simple living. But the Holloways were different from the moment they arrived. It wasn't just that they came after dark. It was the way they seemed to operate entirely out of sync with the rhythm of life in the valley. No one saw them at the church socials, nor at the school meetings. The parents never attended market during the busy morning hours, only arriving at dusk, just before the stalls closed. The vendors noticed that they never haggled, never made small talk. They bought in bulk canned goods, kerosene, matches, dried herbs, and left quickly, returning to their carriage with their eyes averted from the crowd. The family consisted of 2 adults and 7 children, ranging in age from infants to teenagers. What stood out immediately to those who caught rare glimpses of them was the children's silence. Not once did anyone hear them speak. When addressed directly, they responded with nods or blank stares. They wore clothing slightly out of time, high collars, dark colors, boots worn thin at the soles. It wasn't old-fashioned in a charming way. It was somber, almost funereal. Neighbors began to speculate, as they always did in small towns. Whispers passed through the pews and over fence posts. Some said the family had come from out west, where the father had been part of a religious commune. Others claimed they were Europeans, perhaps fleeing some unnamed disgrace. Their last name, Holloway, didn't match any known in the region, though it sounded just familiar enough to avoid raising bureaucratic suspicion. The Holloways' home quickly gained a reputation. Children dared each other to run up the drive and knock, but no one ever did. The windows remained shuttered during daylight. No smoke ever came from the chimney. During the day, the house appeared abandoned, lifeless, as if the very boards refused to creak in the sun. But after dusk, everything changed. Lights appeared behind the curtains, dim, golden flickers that moved unnaturally, as though they were being carried from room to room. No electric lines ran to the farmhouse, and no one remembered seeing the Holloways install a generator. Some believed they used oil lamps, others weren't so sure. The local postman, William Drenner, was the first to report anything unusual. His route took him past the Holloway property 3 times a week. He noticed that the mailbox, an old iron fixture at the edge of the gravel road, was never empty in the morning. Letters would appear, addressed in a fine looping hand, but the mail was never retrieved until long after sunset. One evening, after forgetting to deliver a parcel, he returned around 7:30 p.m. and claimed to hear faint noises from the property. Not voices, exactly more like the soft patter of feet on wooden floors, and a distant, rhythmic splash, like water being stirred in a basin. He never went that way again after dark. Others began to report similar incidents. A farmer from a neighboring plot, Martin Hughes, swore he saw shadows moving across the Holloways field at 2 in the morning, slow, deliberate figures gliding along the rows of unharvested barley, holding what looked like bundles of cloth. The sheriff dismissed it as sleepwalking children, but Hughes was adamant. The shapes weren't human in the way they moved. He described them as too tall, too narrow, and too silent. Livestock refused to graze near the Holloway fence. Horses shied away from their side of the road. Dogs howled facing their property lines, then whimpered and retreated under porches. At least one cow was found dead near their border, its eyes open, its body untouched by predators. Yet somehow, a veterinary exam was inconclusive. Despite the growing unease, there was nothing unlawful about the Holloways. They paid their taxes, filed no complaints, and caused no visible trouble. This made it difficult for authorities to intervene. Despite mounting requests from the community, the sheriff made one courtesy visit in late August, reporting back that the family was quiet but civil. He noted that they seemed healthy, if a little pale, and that the children were peculiar but well-behaved. Still, it was their aversion to daylight that troubled the town most. Not once in 3 months had a Holloway been seen outdoors in full sun. Deliveries left at their porch remained untouched until after sunset. No laundry hung on their lines. No sound of laughter or argument ever escaped the walls. Their entire existence seemed structured around an invisible clock that ticked backward from midnight. As the leaves began to change and the valley dipped into early autumn, the questions grew louder. Who were these people? Why did they live as though sunlight were poison? What were they doing inside that house all night? The farmhouse, once just another relic of the Civil War era, became a landmark of discomfort. Children crossed the road when passing it. Adults quickened their step. No one looked directly at the upper windows. And always, the lights returned when the sky darkened, like a silent signal, or a warning, or perhaps a ritual. By the 3rd month, even those who had tried to dismiss the Holloway family's behavior as eccentricity could no longer ignore the strange consistency of their nocturnal routine. Every single night, without fail, the house at the edge of the woods glowed from within. Long after the rest of Middlebrook had gone to bed, the Holloway residence remained lit, its windows flickering with the steady, low pulse of oil lamps. It was never electric light. It had a deeper tone, golden but uneven, as though alive and breathing with the movements inside. People began to speak more openly about it. The lights were always brightest between midnight and 3 a.m., with shadows crossing behind drawn curtains, slow and deliberate, sometimes pausing as if someone stood in complete stillness just behind the glass. One neighbor counted footsteps, echoing across the wooden floors at regular intervals, during the same window of time each night. Another claimed to hear furniture being moved, heavy scraping sounds, and the rhythmic clink of metal or glass. As autumn deepened and the nights grew colder, The activity inside the house only increased. The locals stopped walking near the property after dark altogether. It was during this time that an incident involving a local boy spread through the county with chilling speed. 12-year-old Raymond Myers had wandered off during a game of hide-and-seek with his cousins, unaware that the edge of the Holloway property was so close. He stumbled through tall grass and reached the southern porch of the house just after 10 p.m. The boy didn't knock. He only listened. What he heard disturbed him so deeply that he refused to speak about it for nearly a week. Eventually, he told his mother that he had heard voices, many of them, not yelling or screaming, but whispering, speaking in soft waves. The terrifying part, he said, was that none of the voices spoke the same language. Some he recognized faintly from school lessons, Latin, French, possibly German, but others were alien to him. Guttural sounds and melodic patterns that didn't sound like human speech at all. He said the whispers didn't come from one room, but from several parts of the house at once, rising and falling in turns like a conversation conducted in a circle. He ran home in silence and spent the next several nights unable to sleep, claiming he could still hear those same voices in his dreams. The Holloways never reported the boy's presence. If they had seen him, they never said a word. Despite the town's growing unease, the family remained entirely unbothered, continuing their isolated existence as though the outside world did not exist. What especially troubled the townspeople was the Holloways' refusal to adopt even the most basic of modern conveniences. When the electric company extended lines through the outer part of Middlebrook, all homes on the road were connected within a week except the Holloways. Crews reported that the family declined the installation, saying it was not needed. They insisted on using well lanterns, thick beeswax candles, and an elaborate system of glass and silver-backed mirrors positioned in curious arrangements throughout the interior of the home. The mirrors, some rumored to be centuries old, were said to have runes etched faintly into the frames, symbols that no one could quite identify. Inside the house, according to the few who ever entered, time itself seemed warped. One such visitor was a physician, Dr. Ellsworth Crane, who had been summoned to the house under urgent circumstances. The Holloway's youngest daughter had reportedly fallen ill with a sudden fever, and the family, breaking with their usual isolation, had requested help. When Dr. Crane entered the house, he noted the darkness of the interior despite it being only late afternoon outside. Thick velvet curtains blocked every window, and the air was laced with a pungent mixture of dried herbs and smoke. The doctor would later report that every clock in the house was incorrect, and not in a casual, unmaintained sense. Each one had been deliberately set forward exactly 12 hours ahead. Noon was midnight. Evening was morning. When asked for the time, the family referred to it as if the sun did not exist. They operated on what Crane described as inverted hours. He also noted that the house seemed to muffle sound unnaturally. Voices echoed too long, footsteps disappeared entirely, and even his own breathing felt heavier inside the walls. Though the patient eventually recovered, Dr. Crane refused to return a second time, citing an indefinable atmosphere of spiritual compression. Several small but persistent rumors also surfaced from deliverymen and tradespeople. A grocer reported seeing several silver bowls of salt placed at the thresholds of each door and window, always freshly poured. A chimney sweep, hired by the county for routine fire safety inspection, refused to even enter the house after seeing what he claimed was a circle of ash surrounding the main hearth. The Holloways insisted on paying in cash-worn bills, carefully folded and sealed in wax. In late October, the pattern grew more pronounced. One by one, the neighboring homes began to report flickers of light, visible from the Holloway windows after midnight, sometimes in distinct patterns. One family saw a triangular formation of 3 lights in the upstairs rooms, blinking in perfect sequence, then disappearing all at once. The sheriff, notified by multiple parties, made another brief inspection. He found nothing illegal. The family was polite. The children stood in a line, silent, their eyes fixed on the floor. The father, Dr. Holloway, gave a short explanation that would pass through the town like wildfire. Night is when the Lord hears us best. That line unsettled even the most devout members of the community. The implication that their version of worship or communion only worked in the hours of darkness was not merely strange, it was heretical. More unsettling was the sheer absence of sleep. Several observers noted that none of the Holloways appeared drowsy or fatigued, even in the early hours of the morning. On 2 occasions, a local baker making deliveries near dawn saw them tending the fields in complete silence, moving rhythmically with tools that gleamed under lantern light. No yawns, no breaks, no rest. As one elderly woman from the village said later, the Holloways didn't live in darkness because they had to. They lived in darkness because something inside them was waiting for the sun to go away, something that couldn't tolerate light, or time, or the turning of the world as most people knew it. And it became increasingly clear that whatever they were doing inside that house each night, it wasn't sleeping. In the early days of July 1927, the heat lay thick over Middlebrook County. The air turned heavy, swollen with moisture, and even the breeze from the hills felt limp and uncertain. Nights stretched longer than usual, with clouds covering the moon and veiling the land in a strange, smothering gloom. It was during one of these nights that the local pastor, Father Samuel Breyer, claimed he heard something no man of the cloth should have to describe. He had been walking home from an evening visit to a dying parishioner, his path taking him within a quarter-mile of the Holloway property. As he passed a break in the tree line, he stopped abruptly. The sound came not from the woods or the wind, but from deep within the ground, somewhere in the direction of the Holloway farmhouse. It was not the cry of an animal, nor the wail of a human in pain, but something deeper, something raw and suffocating, a sound with no place in the natural world. He would later describe it as a scream from inside the earth, as if the soil itself were being torn open. He stood frowning until the noise stopped, then walked the rest of the way home without turning his head once toward the property. 2 days passed in silence. Then, without ceremony, the Holloways made a visit to the local hardware store. They bought heavy chains, dozens of nails, thick wooden planks, and 2 industrial-grade padlocks. The purchase was made by the eldest son, Thomas, who gave no explanation and answered no questions. When asked if they were reinforcing the barn, he remained silent. When asked directly if something had been stolen, he turned and left. The next rumors came from a young boy who lived on the opposite ridge. His name was Ellis Carter, and he often watched the Holloway property with a pair of binoculars given to him by his uncle. On the morning after the storm, he swore he saw 2 family members, believed it was the mother and the youngest son, carrying something from the front room of the house to the back porch. They were barefoot. The boy's limbs hung strangely limp, as if he were unconscious or drugged. They did not walk like they were helping someone else. They moved with rigid intent, as though obeying a silent instruction. They disappeared into the cellar entrance beneath the house. By midday, news filtered through the community. A traveling veterinarian, returning from a farm call, claimed to see all the windows on the north side of the Holloway home boarded shut. He also noticed that the cellar doors had been reinforced with fresh beams and new hinges, bolted from the outside. No one saw any member of the family for 3 days after. What little information emerged came from a stonemason named Arthur Hill, hired weeks earlier to deliver materials to the property. He arrived that week to collect final payment. When no one answered the front door, he circled the house and knocked on the side. A window curtain moved slightly, and a young girl of the Holloway daughters stared out at him with an unreadable expression. She raised her hand and pointed downward, then slowly stepped away from the window. Out of curiosity or instinct, Hill approached the cellar doors. What he saw disturbed him for the rest of his life. At the base of the entry steps, just beyond the opening, the faint outline of white chalk could be seen on the stone floor, not in lines or letters, but in curved-shaped sloping sigils that spiraled inward. In the center of the chalkwork sat a small pile of folded blankets, and atop them, a single leather-bound book. He did not step closer. He turned to leave, but not before noticing something odd. Above the cellar doors, carved faintly into the lintel, was the shape of a key, not a real one, but a burned image, blackened, like an iron brand pressed into the wood. Its lines were sharp and deliberate. The air around it smelled faintly of sulfur and something sweet and decayed. The truth came quietly from the doctor, summoned again in confidence weeks later. He spoke only to the sheriff and the pastor. He said the Holloways had called him after the youngest boy, Joshua, was found unconscious in the cellar. The child had no memory of how he got there. He remembered falling asleep in the upstairs sitting room, something that had apparently never happened before. The family did not sleep at night, and yet on this night, the boy had downsized off in the armchair just after midnight. They found him hours later, barefoot, his eyes wide open but unseeing, standing at the center of the cellar. Around him were markings in chalk, circling in 4 rings, each with a different symbol at the compass points. The boy bore a mark on his wrist, a raised burn, in the unmistakable shape of the same key carved above the door. The skin around it was red but not blistered. It looked more like it had been seared instantly, as if by a flash of heat without flame. The doctor attempted to speak to the boy, but Joshua remained mute for several days. When he finally began to speak again, he seemed normal, except he could no longer recognize certain family members by name. In the days that followed, the Holloways took drastic measures. The cellar was sealed. Chains were fastened to the inside of the doors, drawn tight and locked from within. Large iron nails were driven into every board. The wood blackened around the heads as though heat had passed through them. The entire basement level was closed off permanently, and a small handwritten sign was nailed to the inner side of the main door. "This room has no night." In the weeks that followed, other families living nearby began to report a new phenomenon. Those who dared to observe the house after midnight, particularly from the cover of the woods, claimed to hear music coming from inside. Not instruments, not a radio, but voices, a chorus of them, singing. The sound was low, harmonic, and deeply layered, like a church choir performing in an empty cathedral. Yet no words could be made out. The melody rose and fell with no recognizable pattern, and at times seemed to echo faintly in reverse, as if played backward. Some claimed the sound wasn't coming from the house itself, but from beneath it. Those who heard the singing never approached the house again. Some moved away entirely. And, though the Holloways never spoke of what happened that night, something in them changed after it. Their movements grew slower, their patterns tighter, their boundaries firmer. The lamps inside still glowed, the mirrors still turned, but something behind their eyes had grown darker. more watchful. And no one in Middlebrook ever saw the boy Joshua Smye again. The Holloways stopped attending church entirely by the end of 1927, where once they were seen at dusk services or slipping quietly into the back pews during winter communion. Now they kept entirely to their land. Their absence stirred local whispers, but no one dared visit to press questions. Instead, speculation grew around what, exactly, had shifted inside the Holloway home and why every window now bore dark curtains, drawn tight even during overcast afternoons. A turning point came in early autumn, when a box of old belongings was discovered behind the shelves of the Middlebrook parish storeroom. Among the mildewed hymnals and yellowing attendance records lay a weathered journal. The handwriting inside was angular, delicate, unmistakably feminine. The first page was signed Lydia Holloway. The journal itself had no cover. Its leather binding had long since cracked and curled, but its contents were remarkably well preserved. Most entries were brief, dated inconsistently, and written with an intensity that bordered on delirium. The first few pages chronicled mundane farm matters, harvests, illnesses, ration shortages, but by the 13th page, the tone had changed. Her sentences became fragmented, and references began to appear to things that didn't make sense in daylight. She wrote, "Sleep is not safe, not anymore, not for us. The moment the sun dips below the hills, something in the walls begins to breathe. And then, farther in, dreams come only at night, but the dreams are not ours. They are borrowed, no stolen. If you sleep while it is dark, they see you, they learn your name." The phrase repeated several times across different entries. If we sleep then, they see us. Elsewhere, she described an entity or presence, called the Old Call, which she claimed moved across the floorboards between the hours of 2 and 4 a.m. She never described it directly, but wrote that it sounded like dragging cloth and the crunch of brittle seeds underfoot. She believed this presence was drawn to motionless bodies, especially those whose minds had entered the realm of dreams. On the inside back page, Lydia had written, "They are not bound by walls, only by sight. Keep eyes open, keep breath moving. Do not listen when it speaks through familiar voices. That is how it finds the doorway." A further discovery deepened the mystery. Tucked inside the Holloway's attic chest, hidden beneath layers of dusty linens, a bundle of correspondences was uncovered. Letters addressed to a man named Wallace Hume at the Salem Public Library in Massachusetts, dated between May and September of 1926. The letters detailed Lydia's increasingly desperate requests for esoteric books, many of which appeared to be unavailable in standard catalogs. Among the listed titles, The Inversion of Hours, Chronos Downturned, and Eyes in the Quiet, she wrote asking for material on reverse time phenomena and the cognitive effects of nocturnal inversion. In one letter, she requested guidance on rituals performed in the hour when all clocks lie, which she identified as 3:33 a.m. These letters were never mailed, as if Lydia had written them only for herself or someone unseen. Further archival research revealed a disturbing connection. Middlebrook County had once been part of a colonial township, known as Loughton's Hollow, a settlement that no longer existed on modern maps. Historical documents from the 1700s spoke of a religious sect that splintered from Puritan communities and vanished into the Appalachian wilds. They were called the Night Watchers, or sometimes, more ominously, those who stood vigil. According to sparse colonial records, this sect believed that the world during daylight hours belonged to the dead, that the light revealed only the illusions of the departed. True existence, they preached, belonged to the hours after dusk, when the barriers between perception and truth were weakest. Their motto, found carved into the frame of a ruined meeting house outside Loudon's Hollow, read, "By night we wake, by day we pretend." The night watchers were rumored to practice what they called chronoreversal, a process by which they aligned their waking hours opposite to the sun's path, believing that nocturnal consciousness allowed communion with unseen forces. Some believed they sought knowledge from entities that existed in a form of time, known to humans, entities that only observed during sleep. The night watchers' writings claimed that by refusing to sleep in darkness, they could evade notice. Among Lydia Holloway's journal entries, one page stood out, written in a shaking hand. It read, "They come from the curb of time, the fold behind ours. They do not knock, they seep. If the breath is steady and the soul adrift, they enter." Beneath it, in different ink, perhaps added later, were only 3 words: "We are watched." The Holloway family's routines, in retrospect, began to resemble defensive rituals more than eccentricities. The covered mirrors, the lanterns always burning after dusk, the refusal to install electric lighting, all feet patterns of warding known in old European occult traditions, the excessive use of chains and iron, the boarded cellar, the chanting heard through the walls, all hallmarks of groups attempting to anchor themselves against infiltration. Even the positioning of their house bore clues. Locals noted that the front door never opened at sunrise, not even to accept milk or post. Lydia once wrote, "Dawn is not safety, it is the hour they disappear, not because of the sun, but because the watchers have looked and chosen. Morning only brings illusion." In time, some came to believe that the Holloways were not merely odd or isolated, but the last remnants of a belief system rooted in genuine fear, not of spirits or demons in the classic sense, but of something older, something that observed and remembered, something that whispered in languages that predated the spoken word. Whatever it was, the Holloways did not believe they could defeat it. They could only endure. The night of October 3rd, 1928, held a sense of gathering tension that few in Middlebrook could have described at the time. A cold wind swept down from the ridge, rattling shutters and stirring dry leaves across unlit roads. When the fire broke out in the old barn behind the Holloway farmhouse, it started with a single, sudden flare that burst through the cracked siding as though ignited from within. Neighbors watching from a respectful distance saw the roof erupt in orange tongues, the timbers collapsing almost instantly into a cascade of sparks and embers. The smell of scorched hay and old wood turned the sharp night air acrid, and the flames leaped higher as though beckoned by some invisible force. Within moments, the barn was fully ablaze. A group of local farmers, drawn by the spectacle, raced through the fields toward the fire, torches and lanterns held high. But as they approached the shackled gate that led to the Holloway property, they stopped cold. In the soft glow of their lamps, they saw a solitary figure standing at the far edge of the barn's foundation. It was Hector Holloway, the patriarch, tall and thin, his coat falling to his ankles, unmoving except for the slight, deliberate sway of his head. Around him lay 8 lanterns, ranged in a perfect circle drawn in thick lines of salt. Between each lantern, half-burned tomes lay open, their pages charred at the edges and torn free from their bindings. Symbols runes that few could recognize were scrawled across the exposed paper in dark ink that shimmered oddly in the firelight. The men held their torches aloft, but none dared cross the boundary of salt. The white ring glowed in the flames, untouched, as though repelling even the heat itself. Hector did not flinch as the farmers called out to him, pleaded for him to move. His face was pale and solemn, eyes reflecting the fire's rage. Behind him, the barn bled light into the sky, its collapse imminent. As if prompted by some silent signal, Gector raised one arm, pointed toward the farmhouse, and then turned away, walking with measured steps down the embankment toward the tree line. The farmers watched, horrified, as he disappeared into the shadow of the oaks, his figure swallowed by darkness. When the barn finally caved in, the noise was thunderous. A wave of heat rippled out and sent the farmers stumbling back, their lanterns sputtering. Ash fell like snow across the fields, coating their shoulders and the mud at their feet. They remained rooted until the blaze died to glowing embers, then hurried forward to inspect the remains of the salt circle. The lanterns lay twisted, their glass shattered, but the salt lines still intact. The books were reduced to ash and nothing more. Not a spark nor a whisper of smoke lingered where the circle had stood. At dawn, the sheriff and his deputies arrived, accompanied by the pastor and two local doctors. They searched the barn and its foundation, finding no sign of the Holloways, except for Gector's wide footprints trailing toward the forest. Inside the farmhouse, they found every door and window bolted tight from the inside. Oars, fresh and rough cut, sealed the entrances. No light shone from within, and no sound came, despite persistent knocking. After prying open a window to peer inside, they saw a house in disarray. Chairs overturned, tables bare, hearths cold. The cellar door remained sturdy, locked by heavy chains on the inside. A thorough search of the property yielded no trace of Lydia Holloway or any of the children. Their beds lay undisturbed, linens neatly tucked, as if no one had awakened for months. Meals remained half-finished on the pantry table, dishes dusty with abandonment. Even the family's prized mirrors, once carefully positioned to catch and reflect lamplight, hung dark and lifeless on the walls. It was as though the entire household had evaporated in the night. Rumors spread that evening of shapes moving within the woods, silhouettes slipping between trees just beneath the fire's glow. Some said they saw a dancing shadowy figures, tall and narrow, gliding away from the homestead against the light, their forms bending unnaturally as if unwilling to face the brightness. Others claimed the shapes darted backward, moving in defiance of normal gait, almost as if fleeing something within the house itself. No one pursued them. Fear held them rooted in place until the dawn's gray light replaced the fire's brilliance. Over the next week, the farmhouse was cordoned off, straw bales stacked against its doors to prevent entry, and no trespassing signs nailed to its exterior. The community pooled resources to demolish the burned barn, fearing that lingering sparks might spread or that the structure itself had become a locus of unnatural influence. When the barn was torn down, the circle of salt was disturbed, but no one dared touch the ground where the lanterns had stood. The earth there remained strangely dry and encrusted, resistant to new plant growth and oddly warm underfoot, even as October's nights grew chilly. 6 years passed with the farmhouse standing untouched, a silent monument to inexplicable events. Many thought the Holloways had perished in the blaze, or retreated to some secret refuge. In the spring of 1934, a new family arrived on the same plot. They too came under the veil of darkness, their wagon unloading at dawn. Their windows were immediately shuttered and draped with heavy curtains. They refused electricity, lit candles inside, and installed oil lamps like those of the Holloways. Their name, displayed on a chipped enamel mailbox, read Holloway, a curious variation that sparked hushed conversations among longtime residents. The patterns resumed almost precisely, lights glowing past midnight, children silent in the halls, lanterns arranged in the windows, and a reluctance to step into daylight. Some who lived nearby swore they heard distant chanting when the moon was high, a low, harmonious murmur drifting across empty fields. The farmhouse still bore the scars of that long-ago fire. Charred window frames, a patch of earth where the barn once stood, and the faint outline of a salt circle that seemed to reform each night, though no salt was ever replenished. And so the cycle reiterated itself in the quiet valleys of Middlebrook, where the boundary between dusk and dawn remained forever contested, and the memory of the Holloways endured in the shadows they left behind. The Holloway house still stood, weathered and gray, its shingles curled like old fingernails. The porch slumped slightly on the southern side. The windows, though long since boarded over, reflected no light even when the sun passed directly overhead. Time had dulled the memory of what occurred on that land, but for the few who remembered or dared to, the house remained untouched, avoided, and whispered about. It had become a fixture of cautionary tales, told to children and researchers who passed through with cameras, notebooks, and overconfidence. The grounds surrounding the house bore no signs of life. For decades, grass refused to grow within a 20-foot radius. No weeds, no wildflowers, not even moss found purchase in the soil. It was dried to the touch, yet never dusty, even in spring. When the rains came and fields across Middlebrook bloomed with green, the ring around the Holloway house remained barren and gray, as though scorched from below. Animals gave it a wide berth. Birds never landed on its roof. No nests, no insect trails. At night, the air felt colder near the foundation, as if the earth exhaled something that had no place in the natural order. Local historians who tried to reconstruct the Holloway timeline soon ran into a peculiar problem. Archived letters and birth records since preserved in the town library had become increasingly incomplete. Pages that once described the family's origins in Lancaster or their journey from Europe were now blank. Librarians insisted those records had been intact for decades. Newspaper clippings covering the fire were filed under wrong dates or were missing entirely. Even microfilm copies seemed altered, as if someone had cut and spliced the reels with surgical precision. The staff refused to investigate deeper. One intern, a graduate student cataloging regional histories, left after claiming she heard scratching in the archive basement that matched the cadence of Morse code, specifically the letter H repeated over and over. In 1972, a man named Daniel Pratt purchased the Holloway property under a preservation grant. He was a folklorist from the University of Pittsburgh, intent on transforming the farmhouse into a museum of regional superstition. He moved in alone, converting one room to his office and the upstairs to storage. The locals warned him not to stay overnight, but he dismissed the stories as rural myth. For 6 weeks, he kept a nightly log, recording the sounds, creaks, and temperature shifts of the house. Then, abruptly, he stopped. The last entry in his notebook read simply, 317 again. Always 317, still behind the wall. After his departure, neighbors reported the lights in the house flickered each night at exactly 3:17 a.m. Despite the home being disconnected from the grid, a soft ember glow would bloom behind the windows, brief, like a match struck in a cave, and then extinguished. More unsettling was the sound. Witnesses described it as deliberate knocking, very slow thuds coming from the inside of the house's foundation. It echoed beneath the floorboards, deep and rhythmic, as if responding to something outside. Years passed, and the house was once again left to rot, but curiosity never truly died. Paranormal investigators arrived periodically, always at night, always with equipment that malfunctioned within minutes of stepping inside. Recordings captured little but static, though some claimed to hear a faint whisper beneath the noise, words in no identifiable language, spoken in a layered voice. One camera, left overnight, filmed 23 minutes of darkness before shutting off. When replayed, the footage included a flickering frame of the basement door slightly ajar. That door had been nailed shut since the 1930s. Those who looked long into the Holloway history found themselves changed. Some spoke of dreams not their own, visions of long hallways filled with water, and clocks ticking backward. Others felt drawn to the house, waking up parked near it with no memory of driving. One local man, a carpenter who volunteered to board up the windows again in 1986, lost the use of his right hand days after visiting. Doctors found no injury or infection. He would later confess he pried open the cellar hatch and looked inside. He never spoke of what he saw, but his remaining years were filled with silence, often standing outside at night, staring northward toward the property. There came a growing unease in town that the Holloways had not merely been eccentric or superstitious. Perhaps their behavior had been an attempt to contain something, not to escape it. Perhaps they had not feared darkness itself, but rather something that lived in the space between night and waking, a thing that could not abide noise, or daylight, or chaos, a presence that required stillness and ritual, something that demanded to be acknowledged precisely when the rest of the world slept. A final report, found in the attic of the town's last surviving historian, offered a chilling hypothesis. The Holloways had not fled. They had surrendered, voluntarily, not in despair, but in reverence. They had found a pattern, something older than religion, hinted at in scraps of colonial diaries and apocryphal sermons. The historian's notes ended with a single typed line, centered and unadorned. "It isn't the darkness they feared, it's the darkness that feared them." That line, smudged by what looked like ash or soot, was the last record ever written about the Holloways. Today, the house stands untouched. The wind never shifts its boards. The night never silences its memory. And somewhere, deep beneath the floorboards, behind a door that should never be opened, the knocking continues, always at 3:17, always waiting,